What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through our Week 7 fantasy football rankings at the wide receiver position. Lots of players on buys, tons of injuries at the wide receiver position, so today's slate looks a little bit different once we get into it. Hopefully, you guys aren't struggling with too many injuries yourselves, but with that being said, I don't want to waste too much time on an intro. Let's just hop right into today's video, and let's start talking about these top 36 wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got 7 tiers labeled here on the screen for you guys, as we do every single week. How I am viewing these players in your lineup is how I have them labeled here on the screen. So the guys at the top, those are going to be the elite wide receiver 1s. The guys at the bottom are more so wide receiver 3s on the lower end of the spectrum. So today, we're going to just start it off right at the top. I got 2 players in tier 1 at the elite wide receiver 1s. For me, that's going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who both come in here. Really not too much to note. Obviously, these guys have been dominating for fantasy football. JSN does technically have a bad matchup on paper. It is the Houston Texans, who are ranked 4th against the wide receiver position, only allowing 22.1 fantasy points per game, but I'm not too worried about JSN. He's been balling all year long, and he looks like one of the best wide receiver picks we could have possibly had here this season. Now, moving on to my next tier, this is where I'm going to have the high-end wide receiver 1s. I got a total of 6 players in this tier this week. It's going to be Davante Adams at 3, Justin Jefferson at 4, Jamar Chase at 5, Drake London at 6, Rome Odunze at 7, and then I got Rashee Rice here at 8. Welcome back, Rashee Rice. You were in the high-end wide receiver 1 territory right off the bat. So there's 2 players specifically in this tier I want to talk about. The first one's going to be Davante Adams. Obviously, this week on the road at Jacksonville. It's a good matchup on paper. Right now, Jacksonville is ranked 26th against the wide receiver position, giving up 30.7 fantasy points per game, and there's likely going to be no Puka Nacua. I would be planning on no Puka Nacua. He is not in my rankings this week, so Adams will have the majority of the workload in the receiving core, so this should be a smash matchup for Adams to plug him into your lineup, and that's why he's a top 3 play for me this week. The other player I want to talk about in this tier is Rashee Rice. Now, Rashee, he's coming back against the Las Vegas Raiders. Great matchup for him to be back into the lineup. They are ranked 27th against the wide receiver position, giving up 30.8 fantasy points per game. I expect him to fully enter this offense right back as the PPR merchant, the PPR monster that he was right before the injury last year, and he should be a very, very solid wide receiver 1 play for the rest of the season. Going on to tier 3 for me, that's going to be these low-end wide receiver 1s. I got 5 guys in this tier that are going to take us from my wide receiver 9 to 13. Deebo Samuel, Nico Collins, Courtland Sutton in this tier as well, followed by George Pickens and Jaylen Waddle, and that is the entire tier for me here this week. 2 good matchups we should focus on in this tier. Deebo Samuel gets a really good one on the road at the Dallas Cowboys. It's a good matchup because Dallas is ranked dead last against the wide receiver position. Still not going to be expecting Terry McLaurin in this game. Dallas is giving up 37.9 fantasy points per game, and Deebo Samuel has been great this season, so I'm still going to be playing him as a top 10 option this week against the Cowboys. And then Courtland Sutton is another player that I think has a great matchup. He's going to be playing against the New York Giants. They are ranked 30th against the wide receiver position, giving up 32.5 fantasy points per game to that group. So I think even though it was a bad week for Courtland Sutton last week, obviously he had the Sauce Gardner matchup there on the road in London. I do think this is going to be a good matchup for him here, and he is a low-end wide receiver 1 in my rankings. Let's move on to tier number 4. Tier number 4 is the high-end wide receiver 2s, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. More matchups to talk about for sure. I got a total of 6 players in this tier right now. It is Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas Jr., Chris Olave, A.J. Brown, Keenan Allen, and last but not least, it's going to be DK Metcalf as well. Let's start talking about the top of the tier. Ladd McConkey coming in as my wide receiver 14. It's a good matchup for him. Right now, Indianapolis is ranked 28th against the wide receiver position, giving up 31.3 fantasy points per game, and I'm not necessarily going to be projecting Quentin Johnston to be back in the lineup this week from his hamstring injury, so he's a player where if he's off of the football field, obviously it means good things for Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen, who we can also just kind of attribute this conversation to as well. I think both of these guys are going to be fine plays, especially because we're going to see an uptick in targets. And Ladd McConkey, you saw it last week when Quentin Johnston was out of the lineup. It definitely opened the door for more opportunities here for all of the receiving options, even Oronde Gadsden as well. So let's talk about Chris Olave. He gets a good matchup on the road against the Chicago Bears. Right now, they're ranked 25th against the wide receiver position, giving up 30.7 fantasy points per game to that group. So Olave's been a target monster all year long. The targets have been great. Obviously, the offensive product from the New Orleans Saints hasn't been great but I do think that Olave is a safe, good, not great, PPR type of option for you as a high-end wide receiver 2. We do have a bad matchup for A.J. Brown. He plays on the road at the Minnesota Vikings. Right now, Minnesota is ranked first against the wide receiver position. They've been very good. Isaiah Rodgers has been very good against opposing wide receivers, and they're only allowing 15.7 fantasy points per game. The Philadelphia Eagles experience has been very interesting this year. Obviously, you have times where it's like, yeah, you're getting your guys the ball, and then it fades away, and they're not getting anybody the ball at all. So it is very interesting to see how this has developed. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith complaining a little bit about targets. It has helped a tiny bit, but not a ton. I'm still a little bit nervous about A.J. Brown. Obviously, he is not anymore in that high-end or that low-end wide receiver 1 type of territory for me until we see a lot more targets come his way. But for now, high-end wide receiver 2 in a bad matchup this week against Minnesota. Now, tier number 5 for me is going to be those low-end wide receiver 2s. I got a total of 6 players in this tier as well, so we'll kick it off at 20 with Diggs. I got 21, Tedero McMillan, 22, Michael Pittman Jr., 23, Xavier Worthy, 24, Jameson Williams, 25, Devonta Smith, and that is the entire tier for me. A couple more matchups in this one we definitely want to prioritize. I think right now when you're looking at tougher matchups in the slate, Tedero McMillan is one of the guys who has a tough matchup at the New York Jets. That's the Sauce Gardner matchup. They are top 8 against the wide receiver position, only allowing 25 fantasy points per game, so a little bit tougher for T-Mac this week. And Jalen Coker maybe potentially back in the lineup. If he is, it'll be interesting to see how that affects maybe some of the underneath targets where Coker is going to be playing in the slot a little bit more often. But overall, I'm not worried about T-Mac long-term here the rest of season. Michael Pittman gets another bad matchup as well. It is on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers. They are ranked 3rd against the wide receiver position, only allowing 21.3 fantasy points per game. So this is a tougher matchup for him as well. Obviously, we saw Josh Downs a little bit more involved last week. Guys like Tyler Warren still involved. They still want to run the football with Jonathan Taylor. Pittman's fine as a low-end wide receiver 2, but he was a little bit touchdown dependent to start the year. If the touchdowns aren't coming his way, he's going to be a little bit more volatile than people want. And then I did talk about a bad matchup for A.J. Brown. That applies for Devonta Smith as well. Obviously playing as the number 2 wide receiver in this offense. Bad matchup against Minnesota, not throwing the football a ton still to these wide receiver options, so it's going to apply to him as well. But I do have a good matchup. There is one good matchup in this group of guys. It's going to be Xavier Worthy. He plays against the Las Vegas Raiders. We talked about it with Rashee Rice. Obviously, right now they're ranked 27th against the wide receiver position, allowing 30.8 fantasy points per game. I do expect Rice to command the number 1 wide receiver type of target share that he is going to end up getting here in this offense, but Worthy's going to be a big play guy, and I think this is going to open up a little bit more for him here as the season goes on and some of the defense starts focusing on Rice. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think Xavier Worthy is going to be better down the stretch, but I think he's going to be a little bit more efficient with the touches that he gets, even if the volume dips just a tiny bit now that Rice is back into the lineup. Let's go to the wide receiver 3s, the high-end ones here. In tier 6, I got a total of 5 guys. It's going to be DJ Moore at 26, 27's Romeo Doubs, 28, Jordan Addison. I got CeeDee Lamb here, and we'll definitely talk about that in a second, and T. Higgins as well at 30. There are no matchups in this tier that are either very good or very bad, so nothing matchup dependent that we need to talk about, but there are 2 players with injuries in this tier that I do want to have a little bit of a conversation about. DJ Moore is one of the guys who is injured in this tier. He did have a groin injury after he left that game against the Washington Commanders. He did not travel home with the team, and he stayed overnight for a groin injury. I would be expecting him to potentially miss this game. Now, we don't have any official word from him yet. He's been labeled as day-to-day. We'll see what that means. Obviously, injury reports and practice reports are going to come out today and throughout the rest of the week. But with this game against the New Orleans Saints, I don't think they need him. So if he misses this game, obviously he would come out of my top 36, but I think Luther Burden would be a very interesting name to look at. So hopefully you were able to pick him up off the waiver wire. If he's still on the waiver wire, pick him up. I think he's worth a stash because you could probably play him this week. And I think if Luther Burden is in this game and DJ Moore isn't, we can still view Luther Burden as a high-end wide receiver 3 type of option somewhere in this group of guys as well. Now, the other player that's injured, obviously, is CeeDee Lamb. He's been dealing with that ankle injury. He's missed a couple of weeks. I think he's going to be trending towards coming back into the lineup here this week. We'll see officially what those injury reports look like throughout the rest of the week. So I am nerfing him right now because until we hear officially that he is in, I'm not going to push him all the way up my rankings. However, let me tell you what would happen here if CeeDee Lamb does get back into the lineup. CeeDee Lamb would be a player that would jump all the way up into probably this high-end wide receiver 1 territory for me. He would be right in this range. I think George Pickens would then probably drop down to the high-end wide receiver 2 territory. So you would see a switch there where Lamb goes to the high end and Pickens goes to the high-end wide receiver 2s. If he doesn't play, I think there's more of a chance that George Pickens doesn't enter the high-end wide receiver 1 tier, but moves up a little little bit more towards the top of this low end wide receiver 1 group, and then obviously Lamb falls out of it. So that's kind of the repercussions if Lamb is back into the lineup. If you have George Pickens, not too much of a change. I think it's a couple spots up, maybe a couple spots down, depending on if Lamb gets back in the lineup, but Lamb would jump into those high end wide receiver 1 tier. So hopefully that covers that a little bit for everybody. I know right now it's a little bit tough to know with some of the injury reports coming out later in the week, but you guys want rankings now as we have, the Thursday night football game and some of the stuff coming forward. So let's go to this last tier, tier 7. I got the last of the players to round out my top 36. I do have here at 31 in the low end wide receiver 3 tiers, Kendrick Bourne, followed by Jacoby Myers, Wan'Dale Robinson, Matthew Golden, Josh Downs, and last but not least, Marvin Harrison Jr. We'll talk about him. His is injury related. But I do have Kendrick Bourne as a bad matchup against Atlanta. They are top 5 against wide receivers, 22.4 fantasy points allowed by that group. Should be a little bit tough sledding. We'll see what happens too if George Kittle is back in the lineup. Obviously, Ricky Pearsall, we'll see what happens with him throughout the week as well. Juwan Jennings also banged up. It's a lot of stuff going on here for the San Francisco 49ers. So definitely a lot of things to be paying attention to as far as injury reports go. Jacoby Myers gets a bad matchup at Kansas City. They're top 7 against the wide receiver position, only allowing 24.1 fantasy points per game, and Trey Tucker's been getting a little bit more involved each and every week, so not necessarily the best play for Jacoby Myers. Safe, no real ceiling with him right now at this point in time. Wan'Dale Robinson's kind of the same thing. Bad matchup at the Denver Broncos. Now, while he doesn't necessarily profile as the type of player that is going to be shadowed by a guy like Pat Surtain, obviously that has been the big thing with this Denver defense and why they're currently ranked 2nd against wide receivers, only allowing 19.4 fantasy points per game. Obviously, we saw last week how good this Denver defense is, and they've just been good all year long against the wide receivers. So a little bit harder to trust some of the passing options here in New York, especially because there isn't necessarily a solidified option at the moment, even though Wan'Dale is my preferred guy here in this offense. Josh Downs is another player that has a bad matchup as well. We talked about it with Michael Pittman Jr., but the Los Angeles Chargers are ranked 3rd best against the wide receiver position, so he comes in here as my wide receiver 35 because of that. And then Marvin Harrison Jr. has the chance to move up pretty significantly in my rankings this week, but he had suffered a concussion at the end of last week's game, so he's a player that we need to see him progress through concussion protocol. If he does, he's going to move up the rankings. There is a chance maybe he misses this game. We'll see what happens. Obviously, Kyler Murray is also a question as well, but I just wanted to have him in these rankings at 36 just to talk about it, because if Marvin Harrison is back in the lineup this week, I think I would be moving him probably to the back end of this low end wide receiver 2 tier, probably somewhere right around, Worthy, J-Mo, Davante Smith. That would be about where he's at in my rankings if he suits up because of the concussion. All right, folks, so there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 7 of the fantasy football season. Like I said, lots of buys and injuries this week. Guys like Garrett Wilson, Puka, Emeka Egbuka, all of these guys are out of the lineup. So hopefully you guys have some plugins that you can play this week and help you get a win. We're trying to help you get a win every single week here over on this channel. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel moving forward. That way you don't miss any of the future content. We got a running back version of this episode coming out later today. If you found something today informative, entertaining, and or actionable, do me the favor and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And last but not least, make sure you are a member of the Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.